Son, man, let me tell you something. Dude, this is Aliens versus Avengers, and this comic is amazing. Okay, let's just get into it, right? Let's just jump into it. No big preludes or anything. So this opens up, and it says, it's disappointing, isn't it, to expect one thing and instead get another entirely. I thought a Kree specimen would have shown more resilience. Instead, the host failed post-implantation. A shame, really, to die poorly and in such passing beget nothing. Now, this is a massively important thing that's being established here, because what it's showing is that there are races, or potentially just a race, that will not produce a xenomorph when that race is infected, because it shows this Kree is infected by a xenomorph, but ultimately it dies, and seemingly a xenomorph never manifests. Now, we don't find out whether or not this Kree soldier was actually infected and had a xenomorph trying to burst out of its chest, or if one never gestated in the process. Kree are insanely capable, right? Like, their skin, their durability is incredibly high. So it could simply just be that it's immune to it, right? Or the xenomorph just couldn't break out. Whatever the case is, we end up learning that the individuals talking here and the ones who infected this Kree are the Shi'ar. Now, kind of a sidetrack for a second, right? I know, just bear with me here. For those of you guys who are not familiar with the Shi'ar race, the Kree are like their own race, right? It's a giant race of Kree that are just out there and they have their own empire. The Skrulls are the same way, the Badoon, the Chitauri. The Shi'ar are like the Covenant from the Halo series, where it's basically an entire empire that's composed of different races. The Shi'ar themselves are a race, they're an avian race, and they're kind of the core members of the empire, but there's other groups that have been brought into it. But what these guys say is, let's not cry over spilt milk, brother, not when it's 2 steps forward for each step back. Some call that progress, but we know it by a better name, destiny. And that's when you end up learning that these guys have their sights set on the universe as a whole. Because he says, I wasn't discounting our progress. 4 out of 5 of our attempts were a success. The Strontian, Dabari, and Kotati all produced a successful strain. But the real prize pig of this batch was the Skrull specimen. A delightful surprise that was. Just one problem. The Skrulls have no homeworld to seed, such as the curse of a diaspora race, having only a few sparse populated outpost planets to speak of. Their species numbers fall outside of mission parameters, and yet my faith endures. Now here's a cool thing. Whenever a xenomorph basically grows in the body of its host, it takes on the traits of its host. The question has to be asked here, because Skrulls have the ability to shapeshift, does that mean the xenomorph that comes out of a Skrull would be able to shapeshift as well? The other part of this is they're talking about Strontians here. For those of you guys who don't know, Strontians, that's what Gladiator from the Shi'ar Imperial Guard is, and potentially they're even referring to Gladiator himself. We don't necessarily know because they don't give him a name, although the Strontians are an actual race. Strontians are like very close to Superman. The only difference really between Strontians in Marvel and Superman in DC is Strontians' capabilities are tied to their confidence. Now here's the crazy thing. As these guys continue talking, suddenly an alert comes out of nowhere, right? They realize there's vessels heading towards them, and they say they're on an attacked vector. Can we identify them? Yes, 4 Explorer-class frigates of Wakandan design. It's the intergalactic empire of Wakanda, and we'll talk about what that means here in a little bit, because I do want to circle back around to it. But in the here and now, when the empire boards this Shi'ar research facility, they're initially joined by King T'Challa, right, as most of you guys would expect. What he's also joined by is his Hatut Zaraze. Now, the Zaraze are basically his soldiers, for lack of a better word, but they're not just guys who go out and fight. These are like the equivalent of his Spec Ops guys, right, where the Dora Milaje are his personal bodyguard. These are the elite fighters that go out into the field and fight. But what's awesome is that this also shows this is not the first time they've encountered these, because what happens is when T'Challa gets in, they immediately scan the area looking for xenomorphs, and there's like 3 of them that basically come to attack, and he looks to his son Azari and says, take care of them. And Azari basically does, right? He starts blasting, or at least tries to hit a few of them. And then of course that leads to T'Challa T'Challa stepping up and then destroying the rest. But the ones that he misses, of course, attack exactly like you would expect them to, and then he obliterates all three at one time. Now for Azari himself, kind of a quick little sidetrack, not a great big huge one. Azari is the son of T'Challa and Storm. In virtually every alternate reality that exists out there, that's the unifying factor. So what I'm curious about is, how did things transpire? Because obviously Azari being a grown man, a lot of time has passed, and there's an explanation for why that's the case. Because what T'Challa says here, at least right before this attack took place, is he says, that black hole below us is massive enough to cause severe time dilation. Hours here cost years out there. We bleed time from a planet-sized wound. Find the masters of this place, find them and bring them here. I want them before me. And it's dope, right? He's like, I want them on their knees. Now, of course, they do end up finding them, but this is when you really get to see the full extent of what's going on here. Because what happens is T'Challa's told the command node was mostly empty. This one was purging their systems when we reached the command deck. He was mostly successful, but we were able to capture some of the data. King T'Challa, what they were doing, what they planned to do, the same weapon that they used on the Intergalactic Empire, right? Unleashing Xenomorphs on the Wakandans' Intergalactic Empire itself. They've already launched at least a dozen more. And in fact, one of the guys chimes in, not really T'Challa himself, but he says, those worlds will need to be secured. No one can be allowed to leave, and everyone who has left must be traced and those worlds quarantined as well. We cannot let this spread. But here's the kicker. T'Challa chimes in and he says, under normal circumstances, yes, of course, but the time debt that we've incurred probably limits that being a success. I think we're facing the bug hunt to end all bug hunts, because remember, due to the nature of time dilation, those worlds exist outside the sphere of influence of this black hole. They've been here for less than an hour. Probably 6 months to almost a year has passed on that world. By the time they get there, that world will be overrun. And that's the kicker here, is because one of the guys says there's something else. One of the worlds that these things have been sent to, it was Earth. And that's where you get this amazing moment, because T'Challa's talking to this guy and he's like, what kind of monster are you? And there's some kind of back and forth, but T'Challa figures out pretty fast, this guy is not a member of the Shi'ar race. He says, benevolence, empathy, creation, the defining traits of the living. In these, you seem to be lacking. And he says, you're not living at all. You're just a machine. He's one of the robots, like David, from Prometheus. He was engineered. And there's this dope moment where he says, just a machine. If you prick me, do I not bleed? And T'Challa's like, let's see. And he draws his sword and cuts this dude's head right off, right? He's like, bring the head, we're leaving. And so they're just like, we need to go back to Earth, because at this point, it's all about survival. Now, here is how Earth falls, and it's amazing. It's so cool, right? What it says is this: seed worlds were not chosen at random, but once a world is chosen for the host, the process, regardless of which world it is, remains the same. Each seed probe carries 4 queen eggs inside of it, along with 12 infected hosts in suspended animation. And then 4 locations in proximity of high density population centers are targeted for initial infestation. Placed into suspended animation on the precipice of a life cycle transition, it takes almost no time for a host to yield their hidden bounty, a xenomorph. And this is where it gets nuts. This is why that time dilation screws basically Black Panther and those guys from being able to save Earth. Because we're told within an hour, these alien drones born from the chestbursters are fully grown. And within a day, a hive has been constructed so that the life cycle of an alien queen can begin. Days later, that queen is born and begins producing eggs. From there, the process accelerates. Within 1 week, each individual queen hive will produce a brigade of warrior drones. Within 1 month, an endless army. Within 1 year, a planet-raising horde. And remember, each seed probe contains 4 such queens. It is the perfect delivery mechanism for the extinction of a species, of every living thing on Earth, regardless of if they are baseline humans or something greater. That's cool, right? Because being given this time frame here, right, within a year, an entire world can be raised. That's 1 queen, right? Divide that by 4. Within 3 months, there's enough xenomorphs on Earth to overrun the planet. The superheroes never had a chance. Of course, we end up finding out that the Inhuman city of Attilan island that it could have resisted, it could have stood for thousands of years for the great shield of purity separating them from a dying world. But like the fall of all great atrocities, the Inhumans fell because they're trash. There was no record of the fall of Atlantis. There were no screams to be heard, no king to save them, and calls for help, if there were any, went unanswered. The secret science kingdom of Wakanda held out longer than most, but eventually, like every other nation, succumbed to the Xenomorph horde. Now here's one of the coolest parts, right? And when it became clear that extinction was at hand for all life on Earth, the mutants of Krakoa decided to abandon their island home and use their gateways to flee to Mars. Because in this universe, Krakoa never ended during Marvel's garbage event, The Fall of X. It continued on. And so what we're told is the mutants ran for the safety of the Red Father, all of them except one, Apocalypse. The first mutant would stay and surrender nothing, for the world had now become the arena he always wanted. Apocalypse will fight, and if he lives, he lives. If he dies, he dies. So be it. Only the fittest survive. It is dope, dude. I love the way this is done. I love the way this is done. It's so incredible. And so we're told, and so it was for all the earth, all except the last human city, a stronghold in the ruins of America. No one knows how, but they were ready for what was coming. Like a prophet of doom, the old man of Wayland knew, and he built a city that would withstand the end of the world. And so what you do in this basically last city of humanity is you pick up with Carol Danvers, who arrives to meet with Bruce Banner. Yes, the Hulk is in the story. Yes, the Hulk will fight Xenomorphs. And it's amazing, right? So what goes on here, right, is Carol kind of shows up because Banner's waiting for somebody. But we do get some really cool insight into what happened to some of the most prominent members of the superhero community in Marvel, where he says, well, we learned that, like, of course, Banner basically has cataracts, right, because he's old, right, his eyesight's failing, all that kind of stuff. But he says, it was bad when Johnny and Susan died in the accident. Reed got worse when Franklin and Ben disappeared to who knows where, never to be seen again. He was convinced the universe that he'd bent to the shape of his life was conspiring to take away the only things he really cared about. He was the smartest man I ever met, an unyielding, towering force for good. But by the end, entropy had won its war, and he was a shell of what he used to be. On his deathbed, Reed Richards made me promise, he made me give my word, that I would protect his only living heir. Now, here's the cool thing. Obviously, with Banner talking about Reed and so on and so forth, the Fantastic Four were the Fantastic Four as we know them. They gained their superpowers. So the accident that they're referring to is clearly not the incident that would have normally given them their abilities. So it's not like Marvel Ruins, where everybody just dies these horrific irradiated deaths except for like Reed, who becomes Dr. Doom. Instead, some kind of accident happened. We don't know what it is, but the mention of how Ben Grimm and Franklin had disappeared to who knows where, that is one of two things happening. Either it's Jonathan Hickman's way of writing them out of the story in order to prevent fans from asking the question, why doesn't Franklin use his reality warping powers to fix everything? Or they're out there somewhere and they will return. We don't know the answer to that question, but all we really seem to know here and now is that Johnny, Susan, and Reed are dead, right? So 3 of the 4 main members of the Fantastic Four are gone. And we end up finding out the last remaining heir that Bruce is talking about is Valeria. Now, on the surface, that can seem to be a little disappointing, but it's actually one of the coolest things. Because for those of you guys who don't know, of course, Franklin Richards is the reality warping son of Reed. He can basically bend the universe to his will and control it like clay. Valeria doesn't really have any traditional superpowers, but she's every bit as smart as Reed Richards is, and even Dr. Doom. So if anybody could think their way out of this situation, it would likely be her. And so that's what they're waiting on, right? Like, Valeria's out there. And what happens here is Bruce says, they say this is the last human city on planet Earth, but we're weeks, maybe less from falling. This is not a city, Carol. It's a tomb. And Carol's like, I get that, right? I understand that. But if we lose hope, then that's going to be the end of everything, right? We will die just like everybody else. And so what happens is in the midst of all of this, there's an alert, right? And she's like, toughen up, right? We've got incoming. It's being picked up on a combination of like thermal and motion. And so it's like, she's on her way, right? Valeria's on her way here. Banner doesn't even wait. He turns into the Hulk, jumps out of the building, and bolts. Then we're told that she's also being intercepted by Miles Morales. Yes, dude, I'm so glad Miles Morales is in this story. I love Miles Morales. And so it's just like, okay, I'll let Miles know you're on your way. The Hulk shows up here. Now, there isn't really a Xenomorph fight, right? All you really have is Valeria just trying to flee for her life and like a Xenomorph attacking her and that kind of thing. But basically, Banner shows up, smashes the Xenomorph, and that's essentially it. That's not what I'm talking about, because ultimately, like, there's a little banter back and forth between, Bruce and Valeria, and she's like, look, things got complicated, like, I'm sorry, it's just I got held up for a little bit. Now, here's the thing. Here's the question I'm gonna ask you guys in the comments, and you have to answer this before we get to the ending. Is she infected? Do you think she has the Xenomorph inside of her? I'm not gonna give you an answer until we get to the end, right? But I'm curious to see what you guys say. So ultimately, they end up leaving and they head back. But one of the things that Valeria says is she stole a Xenomorph egg. She says, this is it, right? If we're gonna win, if we have any hope at all, this is how we do it. And so it's kind of like, okay, tell us what your plan is. And she says, by the time these things were a threat, there were already too many of them to fight. But that's what we did, because that's who we are. And so we got into a land war with perfect killing machines. It didn't take us long to realize that they were using humans to make more drones. So we dug deeper into their life cycle and we tried to cut them off at the source. And this is where we went wrong. We tried to stop them here at the implantation stage. The psychology of it was simple. We wanted to save the people who were being used as hosts. But what we didn't realize was that as soon as those things were attached, those people were already as good as dead. We tried everything, science, magic, nothing ever worked. Nothing except starting sooner. And that's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to create a virus that will kill the eggs. But the question asked by Miles is, can you do that? Right? Can you engineer a virus to destroy these eggs? And Valeria's like, of course, I'm Valeria Richards. I can do virtually anything, right? She's like, now, I need everybody to leave so I can get to work. And so what you end up doing is you have Bruce Banner who switches over to his conversation with basically what looks like Peter Weyland, right? The head of Weyland-Yutani, the company, as you guys know it from Alien and Aliens. But the thing about this is that it's not a wildly interesting conversation. It's just kind of the two of them talking and going back and forth, and that's seemingly it. But it's really more of Weyland talking to Bruce and telling him about how not everybody is as weak as he believes they are. And there's a kind of inner courage in everybody else, right? That it's not the outer shell that defines a person, it's what's on the inside that counts. It's a transitionary thing, because what happens is you switch to Banner going to see Valeria to bring her some food. She doesn't answer the door. I told you guys we would find out at the end, right? She doesn't answer the door. And he's like, voice override. And Valeria pops up and she says, hey, Uncle Bruce, if you're seeing this recording, I'm sorry, but you cannot come in. I wanted to do this to win once and for all. I just ran out of time. My plan worked, or at least it was working. I used a light bender based on my mom's powers, and I walked right into the hive. I isolated and grabbed an egg and slowly started backing out. It worked, Bruce. I would have succeeded and gotten away, but then I tripped over something, and then they were all over me. I remember choking in darkness and then waking up and knowing something was inside of me. She's infected. She is a host for a Xenomorph. Bruce freaks because she's just like, don't come in here. Please don't come in here. I don't want you to see this, and I want this thing to stay contained. When Bruce gets in there, that Xenomorph immediately jumps on him, right? This thing goes to use that secondary mouth to take a bite out of Bruce, and Bruce makes it his last one. Dude, he rips this thing's head off. He gets splashed by the acid and it doesn't matter, right? It doesn't do anything to him. He's just like, that's a little inconvenient. But he like destroys this thing, right? So that Xenomorph is dead just like that, right? Which really begs the question, how would Bruce fare against an army of these things? Seemingly not very well, hence the reason why he's not out there destroying every single one that he finds. But what happens when everybody else shows up? Of course, they find that Valeria's dead, right? With the thing having busted out of her. But then they also find that the Xenomorph egg they brought along has broken broken out. It's scurrying around there somewhere. And they're like, okay, it's in here. Everybody keep an eye out. And it immediately bonds itself to Miles Morales, right? So now Miles is being impregnated by this thing. And so it's like, okay, like, what do? We have to get it off of him, right? Carol's like, we have to get this thing off of him. The response of Bruce, we've been over this. It cannot be done. I've seen it tried a million times now. Man, this is the craziest thing I've done. It's man, son. Dude, this, man, I love the way this goes, right? So he says, there's no mind to control. The nervous system is autonomous. Any attempted removal kills the host every single time. And that's when Carol says we have to do something. And the response of Waylon is, yes, we do. Soon, an enemy will be growing inside him. And when it emerges, it will only want one thing, to kill every one of us. We don't have a choice. Burn it. The response of Carol is, I'm sorry, Miles. I wish there was something. And then it's just like, what in the heck? What was going on with Miles? He was bonded to Venom. The symbiote leaves Miles and bonds to the face hugger and says, we don't like this body, but it'll do for now. This is crazy. Like I say, it's a crazy Hickman twist because it's like a parasite gets co-opted by another parasite. And it's like, Miles, are you okay? And he's like, not really. That was terrifying. The Xenomorph controlled by the Venom symbiote jumps onto the chest of Miles, right? And like the Venom symbiote's like, yes, we are fine, right? Miles says, speak for yourself, because there's only one thing that's going to be able to make me sleep at night. We've got to get off this planet. With that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. You guys are going to hate me. Here's the worst thing about this. The next issue doesn't come out until November. It's not my fault, guys. I'm sorry. I wish I could cover the next issue right now. Massive cliffhanger. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video, though. If you did, drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.